We begin with Julian Assange and a news peg like no other. Last week, in court papers filed in the U.S. in a case completely unrelated to the WikiLeaks founder, there was a paragraph confirming that a secret indictment has been filed against Assange. Prosecutors called it an administrative mistake, meaning a supposed clerical error confirmed something that Assange had always feared, but that the U.S. Department of Justice had never admitted. It wants him in jail. It's been more than 6 years now since Assange was granted asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. An investigation into sexual assault-related allegations made by 2 women in Sweden has long since been dropped. But British police say that Assange will be arrested the moment he steps out of that embassy for breach of bail. Less than a decade ago, Julian Assange had media outlets eating out of his hand and governments with secrets to hide on high alert. Now he's at the mercy of an Ecuadorian government that's running out of patience, and he may be running out of time. Our starting point this week is a court document and a revelation never meant to see the light of day. Of all the twists and turns in the Assange story, the initial deluge of classified documents WikiLeaks published, the resulting headlines, the sexual assault-related allegations made in Sweden, the irregularities surrounding those cases, the self-imposed exile on Ecuadorian territory in London, and the 6-year-long waiting game since, this may be the oddest twist of all. A clerical error, a sloppy case of cut and paste that appears to justify Julian Assange's concerns about having to face justice, American style.
There's nothing like a cock-up to make the truth come to light. So, there was a filing on a completely unrelated and not very high-profile case in the Eastern District of Virginia, and they had copy and pasted a section from another indictment. And so this indictment about some totally random guy ended up mentioning Julian Assange. What they haven't said is what the charges are and what period of WikiLeaks activity they relate to.
The clerical error took place at a court in Alexandria, Virginia, right next door to Washington, where a grand jury has reportedly been investigating Julian Assange since 2010.
It will shape an understanding of what the past 6 years of war has been like.
Back then, WikiLeaks was in its heyday. The Iraq and Afghan war logs revealed brutal truths about those invasions, confirming war crimes previously denied by the Pentagon. The diplomatic cables would later expose America's duplicity in its dealings with foreign governments. WikiLeaks was partnering with news organizations, heavy hitters like the New York Times, The Guardian, and Le Monde in France, making headlines around the world. By the end of 2010, Le Monde named Julian Assange its Person of the Year. Time magazine's readers did the same, and Rolling Stone called him Rockstar of the Year. Barack Obama's Vice President Joe Biden had another term for Assange: high-tech terrorist.
If you go and challenge and threaten and undermine the world's most powerful institutions, as WikiLeaks has done, they are going to impose on you retaliation. There was actually a 2008 U.S. Army report that described WikiLeaks as an enemy of the state and talked about different ways that they could destroy the organization. And we can read about that document because, ironically, it got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it on its own website.
The left was very excited about WikiLeaks and excited about the fact that things that governments had traditionally kept secret were no longer going to be kept secret.
Light them all up. Come on, fire!
It seemed to be part of this whole new wave of nothing is secret anymore in the age of the internet.
They fear a domino effect. They realize that inside the US intelligence community, there are many people who have seen all sorts of abuses. They are terrified that there could be 100 Chelsea Manning, 1,000 Edward Snowden. They cannot kill Julian Assange. So all they can do is use legal cases against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, which they have done.
In 2010, a legal case was opened against Assange in Sweden for sexual assault, based on the testimonies of 2 women. He denied the allegations and asked to be questioned in London, a common practice in such cases. He said he feared that going to Sweden could lead to an extradition to the US. The Swedes initially refused, but eventually interviewed him at the Ecuadorian embassy in 2016, 6 years after the investigation began. Then the Swedes dropped the case without ever laying charges, a basic fact that seemed lost on news organizations.
The legal situation for yourself in Sweden, you're now facing charges.
I'm not going to talk about that.
Do you think Sweden will reactivate the rape charges, the two charges that were against him?
Despite the Swedes closing the case, the UK says it will arrest Assange if he steps out of the embassy for breaching his bail conditions. It's a standoff the UN calls a case of arbitrary detention, a denial of Assange's human rights. Stefania Morizzi is an investigative journalist who has probed how the Assange case has been conducted in both Sweden and the UK.
Thanks to my Freedom of Information Act request in Sweden, it was possible to reveal the crucial role of the UK authorities in creating this legal and diplomatic quagmire. For example, advising the Swedish prosecutors to question Julian Assange only after his extradition to Sweden. They write, "Please do not think that the case is being dealt with as just another extradition request." The press was running some stories like Sweden could drop case, says Assange, and the UK authorities wrote to the Swedish prosecutors, "Don't you dare get cold feet."
Even Julian Assange's supporters concede that WikiLeaks' practices can be contentious, such as publishing material without redactions. The Afghan war logs revealed the names of Afghans who had worked as informants for the invading coalition, placing them at risk of retaliation. The Saudi cables, released in 2015, contained the personal details of scores of Saudi civilians, including their medical records. And Julian Assange's decision to publish material during the 2016 US election campaign, emails from inside the Clinton team, hacked by persons unknown, but that US intelligence agencies say came via Russia, damaged WikiLeaks' journalistic standing and infuriated anti-Trump voices in America.
It's true that Julian Assange used to be a lot more popular before somebody undermined American democracy with the help of the Russians and gave us this president who is destroying democracy in the United States and threatening the entire world. I don't see Assange as a victim anymore. I see Assange as someone who helped to victimize American democracy. And if Julian Assange is being demonized for that, then count me among his demonizers.
Conversations that we've been able to read that have been leaked seem to be suggesting that Julian would be willing to do things specifically to help the Trump campaign. Certainly, that's a legitimate critique of WikiLeaks that I think we can all see evidence for. What we've never seen any evidence for is that there's been any even communication, let alone collaboration or cooperation between WikiLeaks and the Russian government, even though for some reason it's now totally acceptable in Western media outlets to simply assert as though it's fact.
Julian Assange has said the source of the Clinton emails was not the Russian government, nor was it a state party. Assange also has issues with his new landlord. The Ecuadorian president who granted him asylum, Rafael Correa, has been succeeded by Lenin Moreno, who wants better relations with Washington. The new government hasn't evicted Assange, but his internet connection, his communications with the outside world are now controlled by the embassy. With his health reportedly failing, the lack of sunlight getting to him, Julian Assange cannot even go to a hospital for fear of being arrested. And Assange also has cause to feel aggrieved by the same news outlets that once feasted on the material that he handed to them on a plate. Not unlike his Ecuadorian hosts, many of those news organizations have turned against him.
If you are in the embassy of a country, you should probably try and be a good house guest. He's also, on multiple times, acted against Ecuador's diplomatic interests. He picked a fight with Spain, which is sort of one of their key European allies. He interfered in the US election, and so, in the end, they will find something to get him out. Or Assange's patience will crack and he'll try and make a break for it.
Whatever you think of Julian, whatever you think of WikiLeaks, what has been done to him over the last 6 to 7 years is a very sustained, serious, and deliberate violation of his basic liberties. And yet that has been almost entirely disregarded by the Western media. Instead, the attempt is to make you view him with such disdain and contempt. It's incredibly insidious because what they're doing is essentially the dirty work of those who are violating Julian Assange's rights, being turned over to the US government, being prosecuted for journalism, for publishing documents, has always been his principal worry, and it ought to be the worry of anyone who does journalism anywhere in the world.